This lesson is going to cover the art of architecture. Now, architecture satisfies the basic human need, one of the most basic ones, and that is to have a roof over one's head. In fact, to have a roof over one's head connotes a feeling of security and is sort of a symbol for architecture. It symbolically speaks of it. And it also, the necessity for having shelter has led humans to design buildings to house themselves really since time began. And this is the art form where the structure is the very most important. In fact, the structure is the fundamental thing in architecture. Now, buildings are used for all sorts of purposes. Sometimes they're whimsical and silly, and sometimes they're works of art in their own right. Of course, this is a famous donut shop in Los Angeles, and here we have the Crystal Bridges Museum in Bentonville, Arkansas. Now, this is a world-class museum located right down the road from Springfield, and it's actually designed by Moshe Safdie, who is a renowned architect worldwide. Basically, in architecture, there's two kinds. We have the shell system and the skeleton and skin system. Now, the shell system is much older. That's how people have been building really since time began. With the shell system, one building material supplies both the structural support and the sheathing. So examples of this would be brick, adobe, stone. Here we have these stone pueblos. They might be adobe, which is actually mud. And here's another example of a shell construction, which would be a cob house. This is a house that's made of corn cobs with a kind of a mud plaster placed on top of it. Now, the other kind of architecture that we're going to be looking at was really not invented until the mid-1900s. And that would be the skeleton and skin structure. So basically, if you look at the bottom here, here's the two main types. One of them, this is the steel frame construction that we see in skyscrapers, and this other one is balloon frame construction, which is how most houses are built. And of course, the photo above is a Mennonite barn raising, and that shows the typical skeleton that would then be covered by the skin, and the skin would be the siding. Now, overall, there's two structures to consider in any structural system. Two factors to consider in any structural system. We have the ability to bear weight and the tensile strength. So, for example, the walls have to support the weight of the roof. Your book lists a really nice example so you can understand how this works. They use the human body as an analogy for how structural stability works. So let's use that here. So imagine that you're laying there on the floor and you're going to attempt to hold your body rigid while you're lifted up. So you're laying horizontally and, for this conversation, let's say 4 people try to lift you up. So somebody's at your ankles, somebody's at your hips, somebody's mid-back, somebody's at your head, and they can all really lift you pretty easily. So let's say instead only 2 people are lifting you up. Then before too long, you're going to lose strength and your body's going to sag and you're going to tumble. So that is what we mean by the ability to bear weight. And it's interesting when you talk about multi-story buildings because the weight has to be distributed, so it's not simply all the weight is on the lowest level of the structure. And that's where engineering comes into play. So another thing that we need to consider is what we call tensile strength, and that's the amount of stretching and stress that a material can withstand before it bends or breaks. Now, this is really important when materials are going to be spanning horizontal distances, as we see when a roof is being spanned by a beam, for example. Now we're going to go through the phases of architecture in chronological order. But as we go through them, I want you to remember that this skeleton and skin wasn't around before the 1800s, and that's what we're looking at here. So the first kind of architecture that we're going to look at is called load-bearing, stacking and piling. And what this means is where you make the walls stacking, like one on top of another, stacking bricks, stacking mud, and you get thinner as the structure rises. Now in this architecture, there's minimal windows because the walls need to be solid in order to support the weight of the structure. So generally you would think, oh, this is probably kind of drab. But look at this. This is the mosque at Janneh. And there's a film about this mosque in this week's YouTube videos. This is a spectacular structure that's adobe coated with a mud plaster. And you can see those little spikes are sticking out of it. Well, that's so that they can attach scaffolding because there's a constant repair of this mud plaster. Now this was originally built in the 1300s, but it was rebuilt in 1907 in the style of the original. So this is load-bearing construction. Let's move on, and we're going to look at post and lintel. Pretty easy to remember. To understand post and lintel, you need only think of a doorway in a home, right? There's the framing on either side, the posts, and the lintel, which is across the top. Stonehenge is a great example of post and lintel architecture. Now I'll tell you, the great masters of post and lintel architecture were actually the ancient Egyptians. That's how they built their great pyramids, was by using post and lintel. Here is a painting from by the artist David Roberts, and it was painted in the mid-1800s. I've included it instead of a photograph because he's done a little bit of embellishment by including the painted tops of the columns, as maybe it's a little closer to how they would have looked originally. Now, one of the things about post and lintel construction is that it can't really span great spaces. You need a lot of posts, and that's called a hyperstyle hall. So in other words, if you have a great hall that's full of posts because it's made with post and lintel construction, that's what that is. Now this is part of the Great Hall of Persepolis, which was an ancient Persian capital. By Darian II actually built it. But this is an artist's reconstruction of the Great Hall of Persepolis. One thing that's interesting that the artist has included is notice the stairs on the right. Well, these stairs were the only way in and the only way out. So they were created so that horses could actually climb the stairs, but they used these walls, which were supposed to be 40 feet tall. I'm not sure if those walls looked 40 feet tall, but that was how Persepolis was protected from invaders. Now we have a group from history that used columns pretty much better than anyone else, or they perfected it, and that would be the ancient Greeks. Now here's something that you're going to need to know, and that would be the 3 Greek orders of columns. Now the top of the column is called the capital, and that's what we see on the right. Now there's a real trick for remembering these, and I like word tricks or memory keys, and that's what I'll give you here. We have Doric on the left, Ionic in the middle, and Corinthian on the right. So let's think about these words. The Doric is the oldest and the simplest. Notice that the base has nothing added. Doric. Doesn't Doric sound kind of old and simple? So the Doric is the simplest. Now Ionic, well, that's easy to remember because if you look at the capital, see how it kind of makes an O? So you would think Ionic. And then the third kind is Corinthian, which just sounds fancy. Doesn't it sound fancy? Well, that's how you can remember because it's the fanciest word of the 3. So these are the 3 orders of Greek columns, and you do need to know them. Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. And the great thing is, after this class, you can be walking around somewhere and you'll go, oh look, there's an Ionic column. Oh look, that's done in the Doric style, etc. Now, there are some other people that were really excellent at using post and lintel construction, although they did it a little bit differently, and that would be the ancient Chinese and Japanese. This is a Japanese structure called the Byodo Hall. And let's see, when was that built. It's in Kyoto, and it was built in 1053. Wow, that is one old building. But notice how it's all post and lintel construction. Now they used a little different kind of a method for their trusses, which is the structure underneath the roof, that allowed for them to have those gracefully sloping roofs. But it's all basically post and lintel. All right, so here we have the post and lintel that was in use for so many years and also had its limits. Now when you look at the ability to span a great space, something else needs to come into play. And that something else is the arch. The arches were actually used in ancient Mesopotamia, but the Romans are the ones who really went to town with their arches, so to speak. Let's look at a couple of ways. First, let's look here. Here's the basic arch. The keystone is what holds it all together. And then we have, if you take an arch and you put a bunch of them in a row, you have what we call a barrel vault. So imagine that you took the arch you see on the left, and you made 4 arches. And then not only that, there's another arch that went up and over the middle of those 4 arches. That would be what we call a groin vault. And a groin vault is what allowed the ancient architects to span great spaces. So let's first look at a conventional arch. And here we have a very famous arch, which is in Pont de Garde in Nîmes in France. And this is an aqueduct. In other words, the Romans made it in France. Now think about it, how far they are from Rome to carry water. And this, the Romans were just expert builders, and they really made fine use of the arch. So now let's look at a barrel vault. This is the old Roman Forum, the big market, okay, in the city of Rome. Now the Romans used these barrel vaults, and they also used the groin vaults to span great spaces. This is a market in ancient Rome. It's an artist's rendering. So the barrel vaults, that's when you have the arch and you kind of stack it up one after another to make sort of a tunnel. That was also used in what we call Romanesque architecture. So this particular example is from a church in Cordona, Spain. So once we get past these rounded arches, in the Middle Ages they came up with pointed arches. Now pointed arches do have great value because they distribute the weight just a little bit differently. This is the interior of what we call the Church of Saint-Denis in France. And Saint-Denis was really the first Gothic cathedral. Notice here how they're groin vaults in that the arches all meet in the middle and open a space up. They span a larger space, but also they have points on them. And once you have a pointed arch, then the thrust of the weight above it is diffused a little bit differently. It takes the weight a little bit differently. And this allows for the architects to go even higher. And as we see with the Gothic cathedrals, going up higher and higher was really what they were looking for. How close could they get to heaven? I think that was part of the deal. So now let's continue along that line and think about when a cathedral is going up, 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 all the way up, sometimes to 150 feet high. How do you keep the outward thrust of the roof from collapsing the wall? They did this with something called a flying buttress. I'm going to come back to this, but I want to show you one in action. So these are flying buttresses. They're these kind of posts on the outside of the structure that support the interior walls and help to balance the weight, to take the weight from this big, heavy interior structure all the way out to the side, and they allowed the structures to go up even higher. So that was a very important development. All right, well that ends this half of the slideshow, and we're going to start back and talk about domes, which are really arches turned in a circle. All right, thanks for listening. Tune in for part 2.